The most expensive mistakes are usually the ones people call shortcuts. The metallic whine of a cutting wheel sliced through the quiet before my alarm ever had the chance. I remember the smell first, hot steel mixing with fresh-cut grass and diesel exhaust, drifting through my bedroom window in a way that instantly told me something was wrong. By the time I stepped onto my back porch with my coffee still warming my hand, the fence my father and I had built 12 years earlier already had a 12-foot gap carved straight through the middle. Bright yellow sparks danced across the morning air, while an enormous $85,000 crane rolled forward as casually as if it were driving through a public parking lot instead of my backyard. My neighbor, Greg Harrison, stood with one boot resting on a stack of lumber, sipping coffee from a stainless travel mug. He looked up, flashed a confident grin, and lifted 2 fingers in a lazy wave. "Don't worry," he called. "I'll throw a few boards back up when we're done." That was it. No apology, no permission, no hesitation. Just a man who believed my property line was an inconvenience standing between him and his construction schedule. What Greg didn't know was that those missing boards would eventually become the most expensive shortcut he had ever taken. My name is Ethan Walker, and I'm 39 years old. I own a small heavy equipment contracting business outside Boise, Idaho. My work revolves around measurements, permits, easements, and contracts. I've spent nearly 2 decades learning that the difference between legal and illegal is often measured in inches instead of miles. That habit followed me home years ago when I bought the 5 acres next to Greg's property after my father passed away. Every survey marker, every corner post, every fence section had been installed exactly where licensed professionals said it belonged. My father always told me that fences weren't built because neighbors hated each other. They were built so good neighbors never had to argue. Looking at those shattered cedar boards scattered across my lawn, I could almost hear him saying it again. Greg had moved in less than a year earlier with big plans and even bigger machines. Every week another trailer arrived carrying concrete forms, steel beams, or equipment worth more than most houses. He loved telling everyone how deadlines were everything in construction. He also loved acting like everyone else's time, land, and patience belonged to him. A month earlier, he had asked if he could temporarily remove part of my fence so his crane could reach the back of his property. I smiled, thanked him for asking, and politely said no. There were safer routes that stayed entirely on his land. They were slower and more expensive, but they existed. Apparently, Greg decided that my answer was just another obstacle to cut through. As the crane's massive tracks pressed deep into the soft ground beyond the broken fence, I simply stood there listening to the slow rumble of diesel engines, smelling crushed cedar and damp earth, watching every tire rotation, every footprint, every careless move. I never raised my voice. I never stepped in front of the machine. I only reached into my pocket, unlocked my phone, and quietly pressed record. Most people think property damage begins with broken wood, but it actually begins with broken respect. I lowered my phone just enough to keep the crane in frame while pretending I was simply watching the job. Greg never once asked his crew to stop. The operator eased the machine forward, its steel tracks leaving deep impressions across the strip of grass that separated my fence from the gravel path leading toward the back of my property. The air carried the heavy scent of hydraulic fluid and warm diesel, while every slow rotation of those tracks pressed the damp soil deeper into the ground. One worker glanced at me for half a second before looking away, almost like he already knew they should not have been there. Greg, on the other hand, acted as though we were old friends sharing a casual Saturday morning. He even raised his coffee cup toward me again before turning back to direct the crane into position. I had seen that kind of confidence before. In my business, people usually became careless the moment they convinced themselves that being busy made them right. My father spent 40 years building custom barns and equipment sheds across southern Idaho. From the time I was 12 years old, I followed him from one job site to another carrying tape measures, digging post holes, and learning that every inch mattered. He never rushed a survey. He never guessed where a property line belonged. He would rather lose a contract than cross onto someone else's land without permission. When he retired, he told me something I never forgot. He said that your reputation is built exactly the same way as a fence, one post at a time, and once somebody knocks enough of them down, rebuilding takes far longer than putting them up the first time. After he passed away, I kept this property exactly the way we planned it together. The cedar fence was not decorative. Every post matched licensed survey markers placed after a full boundary inspection. Underground irrigation lines followed carefully measured routes, and I kept every receipt, permit, inspection report, and maintenance record inside a waterproof filing cabinet in my workshop. Friends joked that I documented everything like an accountant instead of a contractor. They were probably right. Years of working around commercial equipment had taught me that paperwork usually settled arguments long before emotions ever could. Greg never understood that mindset. Since moving next door, he had treated every conversation like a negotiation he had already won. First, it was borrowing part of my driveway for deliveries. Then it was asking if suppliers could temporarily stack lumber near my fence. After that came his request to remove a section of it so larger equipment could reach the rear of his lot. Every single time I answered politely. Every single time I suggested legal alternatives that stayed entirely within his own property boundaries. Every single time he walked away looking disappointed but never angry. Watching him now, calmly directing thousands of pounds of machinery across ground he had no right to enter, I finally understood that he had never accepted my answer. He had simply waited until he believed I was too late to stop him. He smiled because he thought the hardest part was already over. In reality, he had only just begun creating evidence. The crane finally reached the rear corner of Greg's property nearly 40 minutes later, but the damage did not stop when the engine went quiet. Workers began unloading steel beams, stacks of lumber, and pallets of concrete forms, all while walking back and forth through the opening where my fence had stood only an hour earlier. Every trip left another set of muddy boot prints across the grass my father used to mow every Saturday morning. The sharp scent of fresh cedar mixed with the damp smell of overturned soil, and every breeze carried tiny wood shavings across my yard like silent reminders that somebody else's convenience had just become my problem. I kept recording until my phone battery dropped below 20%, then switched to a second battery pack I always carried in my truck. Old habits from construction sites die hard. Nothing important should ever stop because of a dead battery. Around noon, the crane operator finally shut the engine down, and the sudden silence felt almost unnatural after hours of hydraulic pumps and diesel rumbling through the neighborhood. Greg walked over with the relaxed confidence of someone expecting a simple handshake. He glanced at the broken fence, shrugged, and smiled. "We are finished with the crossing," he said. "I will have one of the guys nail a few boards back this afternoon. Nobody will even notice." I looked past him at the crushed tire marks leading across my property. Several sprinkler heads had disappeared beneath the heavy tracks, and the ground around one survey marker had been pressed several inches lower than before. A section of decorative stone edging that bordered my flower beds had shifted completely out of alignment. None of it looked dramatic. That was exactly why people underestimated property damage. The expensive part was almost never what your eyes noticed first. It was everything hidden underneath. Greg must have mistaken my silence for acceptance because he laughed softly before adding, "Come on, Ethan. We are neighbors. No reason to make a big deal out of this." I simply nodded once and replied, "I hope the rest of your project goes smoothly." His eyebrows lifted in surprise, almost disappointed that I was not arguing. He gave me another confident smile before walking back toward his crew. I watched him disappear behind stacks of framing lumber while the sound of nail guns echoed from his lot. A few minutes later, one of his workers leaned several loose fence boards against the opening as if gravity alone would somehow replace years of careful construction. They never even attempted to reset the posts or align the rails. By sunset, everyone had gone home, leaving behind muddy tracks, broken cedar, scattered hardware, and a temporary gap that swayed every time the evening breeze crossed the property. I walked the entire boundary with a measuring wheel, taking photographs every 10 feet from multiple angles. Then I photographed every survey marker, every damaged sprinkler head, every displaced stone, and every visible track left by the crane. The cool evening air smelled faintly of wet earth after the irrigation cycle tried unsuccessfully to water lines that no longer worked. Standing there in the fading light, I realized something Greg had completely overlooked. He believed the story ended when his crane reached the other side. Mine had not even reached the part where the real numbers started. The next morning, I did exactly what I always did before bidding a commercial project. I measured first and assumed nothing. The cool air still carried the earthy smell of damp soil, and the broken cedar posts cast long shadows across the lawn as I stretched a measuring tape from one survey marker to the next. Every number matched the original survey, which meant the boundary had never been in question. Only Greg's decision had been. Instead of replacing the temporary boards his crew leaned against the opening, they returned with more deliveries. Concrete trucks rumbled onto his lot before sunrise, forklifts beeped in reverse, and another flatbed rolled past carrying structural steel. Every vibration seemed to shake loose another reminder of yesterday's shortcut. I walked over to the damaged area where the crane tracks crossed my irrigation zone. The grass already looked different. Water pooled in one section while another remained completely dry. I carefully brushed away loose dirt with my work glove until the cracked sprinkler line came into view. A few feet farther, another fitting had separated underground, slowly leaking into the soil beneath the surface. None of it would have been obvious to someone walking by, but years of working around excavation equipment taught me exactly what thousands of pounds of track machinery could do beneath finished landscaping. I photographed everything with close-up shots, wide angles, timestamps, and measurements. Then I opened the waterproof cabinet in my workshop and pulled out a thick binder labeled property records. Inside were the original fence invoices, irrigation installation diagrams, certified survey documents, and maintenance receipts dating back years. My father used to joke that paperwork was cheaper than lawyers. Standing there with those records spread across my workbench, I started believing he had underestimated just how valuable good records could become. Around lunchtime, my phone rang. It was Greg. His voice sounded cheerful, almost casual. He asked if everything looked all right now that the crane had finished its work. I thanked him for calling and calmly explained that I was still documenting the condition of my property. There was a brief silence before he laughed. "Come on, Ethan," he said. "Surely you are not making a federal case out of a few fence boards." I looked through the workshop window at the broken opening still facing my yard. "No," I answered. "I am simply figuring out what it actually costs to put everything back the way it was." He replied that I could buy new cedar boards for a couple $100s at any hardware store. Then he wished me a good afternoon and ended the call before I could respond. That conversation told me everything I needed to know. Greg believed the only thing he had damaged was wood. He had never considered buried irrigation, compacted soil, disturbed grading, displaced stone edging, professional labor, or the cost of rebuilding a surveyed fence to its original specifications. By late afternoon, I had already scheduled 3 appointments. One with the licensed surveyor who originally marked the property, another with the irrigation contractor who installed the underground system, and a third with the fencing company that had built the cedar boundary years earlier. As the sun settled lower behind the cottonwood trees, the neighborhood grew quiet again, but I knew the silence would not last much longer. Real numbers were about to replace assumptions, and assumptions had been carrying Greg's confidence ever since the first fence board hit the ground. The surveyor arrived just after 8 the following morning in a white pickup truck coated with the fine layer of dust that seemed to follow every rural road in Idaho. He climbed out carrying a bright orange equipment case that I recognized immediately because it was the same company my father trusted years earlier. The crisp morning air still smelled of wet grass, but underneath it lingered the faint scent of disturbed soil where the crane had crossed my yard. Without saying much, he unpacked his GPS equipment, located the original boundary pins, and began taking measurements with the calm confidence that only comes from decades of repeating the same careful process. Every few minutes, he compared his digital readings with the certified survey filed at the county office. After nearly an hour, he looked up and gave me a small nod. "Your fence was exactly where it belonged," he said. "Not close." Exactly. Those 2 words carried more weight than an argument ever could. By mid-morning, the irrigation contractor arrived. He shut off the water supply before carefully exposing sections of the underground system with hand tools instead of heavy equipment. The damp earth released that rich smell only freshly turned soil has, and within minutes the problem became obvious. 2 supply lines had cracked under the weight of the crane, 3 sprinkler heads had been crushed below grade, and 1 control valve had shifted just enough to create a slow leak that would have gone unnoticed for weeks if I had not inspected it immediately. The contractor photographed every damaged component before writing notes on a clipboard. He told me the repairs would require replacing pipe sections, resetting valves, pressure testing the system, and restoring the landscaping afterward. That afternoon, the fencing company owner walked the entire property with me. He measured every post, checked the alignment of the remaining sections, and ran his hand across the splintered cedar where the cutting wheel had entered. He shook his head before explaining that matching weathered cedar was almost impossible. Replacing only the missing section would leave an obvious patchwork that lowered both appearance and structural consistency. The proper repair meant rebuilding the entire affected run so everything lined up correctly again. By the time his estimate landed in my hands, the numbers had already climbed far beyond what Greg imagined when he joked about buying a few replacement boards. I stacked every report neatly across my workshop table beside the original permits, invoices, photographs, survey records, and maintenance logs. Then I opened my laptop and created a timeline beginning with Greg's original request to cross my property several weeks earlier. I included text messages, dates, photographs, phone records, and every invoice in chronological order. Looking at the complete file, the story almost assembled itself without my help. It showed permission requested, permission denied, property entered anyway, damage documented, and professional inspections confirming exactly what had happened. Late that afternoon, Greg drove past in his shiny black pickup, slowed near the broken fence, and smiled through his open window. "Everything getting fixed?" he called with the same relaxed confidence. I smiled back, just as politely. "The inspections are almost finished," I answered. He gave me a thumbs up and continued toward his driveway without another question. Watching his truck disappear behind the half-finished house, I realized he still believed this was a conversation about lumber. He had absolutely no idea it had already become a file thick enough to answer every question anyone would eventually ask. 3 days later, every estimate had arrived, and for the first time I could see the complete picture instead of scattered pieces. The workshop smelled faintly of sawdust and machine oil as I spread every document across the old oak table my father had built decades ago. The survey report confirmed the exact location of the property boundary. The fencing contractor detailed the labor required to rebuild the damaged section so it matched the existing structure. The irrigation company listed every broken line, crushed sprinkler head, damaged valve, and the hours needed to restore proper pressure throughout the system. The landscaping estimate covered grading the compacted soil, replacing decorative stone edging, reseeding the lawn, and repairing the drainage path the crane tracks had flattened. None of the numbers looked outrageous by themselves. Together, they told a very different story. I entered each figure into a spreadsheet, double-checked every invoice, and attached supporting photographs beside each line item. When I finished adding everything together, the total settled just over $13,000. I stared at the number for a long moment, not because it surprised me, but because it perfectly illustrated something people rarely understand. Property damage is almost never about the object you can see. It is about everything connected to it. I did not want revenge. I wanted restoration. That afternoon, I contacted my insurance agent, someone I had worked with for years through commercial equipment policies. After reviewing the documentation, he told me the file was one of the most organized property damage claims he had ever seen. Every photograph matched a report. Every report matched a receipt. Every receipt matched a date. There were no gaps for anyone to question. He explained that because another party had caused the damage, I should first provide them an opportunity to resolve the matter directly before insurance became involved. That was exactly what I intended to do. I assembled a clean binder containing the survey, inspection reports, contractor estimates, photographs, maintenance records, copies of text messages, and a simple cover letter requesting reimbursement for the documented repairs. There was no emotional language, no accusations, and no threats. Only facts supported by evidence. Before sealing the envelope, I read the letter one final time. It simply stated that the enclosed documents reflected the cost required to restore my property to its previous condition and requested payment within a reasonable period so repairs could begin. As I slipped the binder into a large mailing envelope, I could hear the steady rhythm of hammers from Greg's construction site drifting across the property line. His crew sounded busy, laughing occasionally as nail guns echoed through the afternoon air. They had no idea that while they continued building one project, another had quietly reached completion inside my workshop. Mine was not made of concrete or steel. It was built from measurements, records, photographs, invoices, and patience. I drove to the certified mail office just before closing, watched the clerk stamp the receipt, and carefully folded the tracking copy into my wallet. Walking back to my truck, I felt strangely calm. Greg still believed this entire situation could be solved with a handful of cedar boards and a quick apology. Within a few days, he was going to discover that shortcuts have a habit of collecting interest long after the work appears finished. The certified mail receipt showed the envelope had been delivered at 9:42 on Tuesday morning. I knew because I checked the tracking number exactly once before closing the browser and getting back to work. By lunchtime, my phone buzzed. Greg's name flashed across the screen. I answered with the same calm voice I had used from the beginning. There was no greeting on his end, only an irritated laugh. $13,000, he said. You cannot be serious. I leaned back in my office chair and looked through the window toward a loader parked outside my equipment shop. The familiar smell of grease and fresh coffee filled the room, while the hydraulic compressor hummed softly in the background. The estimates are all in the binder, I replied. Every number comes from licensed contractors. He immediately dismissed them. According to Greg, replacing a few fence boards should cost a few $100s at most. He insisted the sprinkler damage could not possibly have come from his crane and claimed the landscaping would grow back on its own. I listened without interrupting. Years of negotiating construction contracts had taught me that people often reveal far more when they believe nobody is challenging them. After several minutes, he finally paused. Look, he said, I will send one of my guys over this weekend. We will patch the fence, throw down some grass seed, and call it even. I thanked him for the offer and quietly explained that the repairs required licensed professionals because the damage extended beyond the visible fence. Another long silence followed before his tone changed completely. If you try taking this any further, he warned, you are going to spend more on lawyers than you will ever recover. His words did not upset me. They actually confirmed exactly what I suspected. Greg still had not opened half the documents inside the binder. He was arguing with assumptions instead of evidence. After the call ended, I forwarded copies of every report to my attorney, someone who specialized in property disputes involving contractors and construction access. He reviewed everything that afternoon and called me before dinner. His first question surprised me. Did he admit on the phone that he authorized cutting the fence? I smiled because I remembered every word Greg had spoken during that first morning. I had written detailed notes immediately afterward while the conversation was still fresh in my memory. Between those notes, the photographs, the survey, the contractor reports, and the video showing the crane entering through the opening his crew created, the timeline remained remarkably consistent from beginning to end. My attorney explained that well-organized documentation often resolved cases long before anyone stepped inside a courtroom. He drafted a formal demand package that included every supporting document, the repair estimates, and a clear deadline for payment before additional legal remedies would be considered. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just facts presented in order. 2 days later, another certified envelope left his office. This one carried considerably more weight than mine had because it represented more than damaged property. It represented accountability. Meanwhile, Greg continued building his house as though nothing had changed. Every morning, I heard nail guns, forklifts, and diesel engines drifting across the property line. Every evening, I watched the unfinished structure grow a little taller. He believed progress was measured by what he built. I had begun measuring it by what he could no longer ignore. 5 business days after the second certified letter arrived, the first crack in Greg's confidence finally appeared. It started with a pickup truck I had never seen before pulling into his driveway just after sunrise. 2 men stepped out wearing company shirts embroidered with the logo of his commercial insurance carrier. They carried clipboards, measuring wheels, cameras, and a laser distance meter. Watching them walk directly toward the opening in my fence told me everything I needed to know. Greg had finally reported the claim. The cool morning breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar and damp soil, while the insurance adjusters carefully photographed every damaged area I had documented weeks earlier. They measured the fence, examined the irrigation repairs, checked the survey markers, and even asked to review the original installation records. Fortunately, every document was already organized inside labeled folders waiting on my workshop table. One adjuster quietly flipped through the reports while the other compared timestamps on the photographs with the survey documents. Their questions were straightforward because the evidence was straightforward. There were no missing pieces left for anyone to guess. Greg spent most of the inspection standing with his arms crossed, occasionally pointing toward the fence while explaining that everything had been blown out of proportion. I could not hear every word, but I noticed the adjusters rarely responded. They simply continued taking measurements and writing notes. Before leaving, one of them thanked me for keeping such complete records. That simple sentence stayed with me longer than anything else said that morning. 3 days later, Greg knocked on my front door for the first time since all of this began. The confident grin I had grown used to was gone. He looked tired, and the folded papers in his hand had clearly been opened and closed more than once. He asked if we could talk. We sat on the back patio where the newly repaired sprinkler system quietly sprayed a fine mist across the lawn. The fresh smell of wet grass drifted through the air while neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Greg admitted that his insurance company had questioned whether the damage resulted from an intentional decision to enter private property after permission had been denied. Because of that issue, they were disputing portions of the claim while conducting additional review. He rubbed his forehead before saying something I never expected to hear. I should have just listened the first time. There was no anger in his voice anymore, only frustration with a situation that had become far more expensive than he imagined. I told him the repair estimates had never been about punishing him. They reflected exactly what licensed professionals determined was necessary to restore the property. Nothing more and nothing less. Greg nodded slowly while looking toward the rebuilt section of fence. The temporary boards his crew had leaned against the opening were long gone, replaced by properly installed cedar that matched the original design. After another quiet moment, he unfolded the papers in his hands. They contained a proposed settlement covering the documented repair costs along with reimbursement for the professional inspections that became necessary after the unauthorized entry. The total remained just over $13,000. Greg stared at the final number before letting out a long breath. The shortcut that had saved him a few hours with an $85,000 crane had quietly grown into the most expensive lesson of his entire construction project. The settlement check arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon in a plain white envelope that looked far less impressive than everything it represented. I remember standing beside my mailbox with the late summer sun warming the back of my neck, while the familiar scent of freshly cut hay drifted across the neighboring fields. Inside was exactly what the repair estimates had documented. Just over $13,000, enough to restore every inch of the property without cutting corners or accepting shortcuts. I deposited the check the next morning and immediately scheduled the remaining work. Over the next 2 weeks, the fencing crew carefully finished every detail, matching the cedar grain and stain so closely that even I had trouble remembering where the original damage had been. The irrigation contractor pressure tested the entire underground system one final time, and the soft clicking sound of each sprinkler head rising evenly from the lawn felt strangely satisfying. New grass gradually replaced the compacted tracks, the decorative stone edging returned to its original alignment, and by the end of the month the property looked almost exactly the way my father and I had left it years before. Greg's construction project eventually reached completion as well, but something about our neighborhood had quietly changed. Whenever large equipment arrived after that, temporary fencing appeared, plywood road protection was installed, written permission was requested, and survey flags marked every access point before a single machine moved an inch. More than once I watched contractors stop at my driveway simply to confirm they were staying entirely on Greg's side of the property line. Nobody seemed interested in shortcuts anymore. Several months later, I ran into Greg at the local hardware store while both of us were loading lumber onto flatbed carts. He walked over, shook my hand, and apologized again without making excuses. He admitted that losing a few hours by taking the proper access route would have been far less expensive than trying to save them by crossing someone else's land. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and we spent the next few minutes talking about fencing materials instead of legal documents. That conversation felt far more valuable than any argument ever could have been. Sometimes people really do learn, but only after the invoice arrives before the lesson does. Every evening now, I still walk the same property line my father taught me to respect when I was a boy. The cedar posts stand straight, the survey markers remain undisturbed, and the quiet sound of the irrigation system moving across the lawn reminds me that careful work always outlasts careless decisions. Looking back, I never won because someone else had to pay. I won because I refused to answer disrespect with anger or assumptions. I answered it with patience, documentation, and the simple decision to let facts speak louder than frustration. My father used to tell me that a good fence does more than separate two properties. It defines where responsibility begins. I finally understand exactly what he meant. Some people believe the strongest boundary is built from cedar, concrete, or steel. They are wrong. The strongest boundary is the one protected by preparation, honesty, and the willingness to do things the right way even when someone else chooses the easy way. In the end, justice was never loud. It never needed to be. It arrived quietly, one document at a time, until the only thing left standing stronger than the fence was the lesson behind it.